My name is Cathy Collins, and I'll be co-hosting Airing Addiction with Lisa Blanchard.
No one story is the same as someone else's, but each journey is different.
Thing on the table.
Having run substance use treatment programs for over 20 years, trying to make sure that we are welcoming to all. I love the idea that kind of having that exposure and that affirming place, even for one person, impacts that milieu, which then can impact maybe the broader recovery community, the community at large. I mean, I really love that thought.
Another edition of Airing Addiction podcast. My name is Cathy Collins, and I'm here with my co-host Lisa Blanchard. We have a special guest today in the recovery area of things, and a special co-host, Jesse, who's going to be jumping in as well. He's going to be taking over my spot moving forward. So as of right now, it's going to be the three of us interviewing our guest, and I'll hand it over to Lisa to introduce her.
Thanks so much, Cathy. This is a really special episode. I'm really excited for it today. Of course, for our wonderful guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment, but also just the opportunity to do kind of a shared co-host podcast and recognize, all of the great work that we have done together, Cathy, and has really developed some great relationships, which we'll talk about, but also to really welcome Jesse as our new Airing Addiction co-host and my new counterpart. Which I think that balance of having, kind of the clinical perspective, but the lived experience perspective. And if anybody has not listened to Jesse's podcast that we had done kind of about a year ago now, please do. Jesse's got a great story to tell. But I'd love to shift us over to introduce our guest today. And so our guest today is Cathy O'Leary. She's the Director of Recovery Support Services at North Suffolk Mental Health. And I'm really excited to introduce you, Cathy. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, you're welcome. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So Cathy, why don't you just kick us off with sharing about as much as your story as you'd love to, but we'd love to hear kind of your story and how you've kind of become a recovery coach and a director of recovery coach support services.
So my name is Cathy O'Leary. I'm currently the director of recovery support services for North Suffolk Mental Health. And I'm also a treatment consultant for CARE, which is federal probation, federal drug court actually, but the probation department. And I'm also a woman in long-term recovery. And what that means to me is I haven't used alcohol or any other illicit substances since January 25th, 2011.
We're getting feedback, sorry. Does somebody need to be muted, James? We're getting feedback, so we're not sure what's happening. Go ahead, Cathy.
So with that being said, I grew up in Charlestown, which is a very tight-knit neighborhood in Boston. I grew up in a very loving and kind household. My parents are wonderful. They did the best they could with what they had. I had an older brother who passed away when he was 2.5. And then I have a younger sister who's a year younger than I am. There was like really no alcohol, no abuse, none of that. I never seen any of that in my house. My parents really sheltered us. And although they gave me the world, I always focused on that one thing that was missing. Like I can remember from a very young age trying to fill that hole in my soul. And, if they got me everything on my Christmas list and one little thing was missing, that's the one thing I would focus on. And it would literally devastate me for months. And like I had all of the isms, I believe, before I had the disease. I loved to steal. I loved the way it made me feel. I stole everything that wasn't nailed down. I mean, I remember getting caught stealing when I was like 11 years old in Filene's basement. I think I was in 7th grade at Latin, and like my mom having to come and get me. And the guy that grabbed me, the security guard, asked me where I was from. And I said, Charlestown. And I said, what are you doing this for? And he was like, he made some funny comment, what he thought was funny about like selling crack in the lingerie department because of where I was from. And, I didn't realize how perceptions and people viewed some of the environments which we grow up in. And, I just felt like because of where I was from and the family I came from, I was like protected and in this little bubble. And like, I didn't really leave that environment. It was 1 square mile. I didn't have to go anywhere. Like that's where I felt safe. I started drinking at a very early age. Drinking led to other substances. I was kindly asked to leave Latin Academy when I was after my junior year due to my grades, but that was all due to substances and alcohol, and skipping school to go drink and hang out with my friends. And I ended up transferring to another school. I stopped drinking. I smoked weed occasionally, but I wasn't doing what everybody else was doing. I was kind of like the designated driver. I was the only one of my friends that had a license or a car. And things got better. But like at such a young age, you don't see the correlation between the two. So like I didn't realize that if I put the alcohol and the substances down, my grades would get better. My dreams would come true. My aspirations and morals and all of those things would come back. I was just too young and naive to see that. So I got into a lot of really good schools and I ended up going to UMass Amherst because it was far enough away, but close enough to home that, it was somewhere in the middle. And up there, things changed drastically and dramatically overnight. I drew all these imaginary lines in the sand that I was never going to cross. And I crossed them almost immediately, like without hesitation. And like I was up there for 3 years. My drinking definitely progressed to a point of no return. I would come home on like break, and my parents had me seeing like psychologists and psychiatrists over on Charles Street. And I just remember like eating handfuls of benzos and like going over there and talking to this woman and trying to convince her that my mom was the problem. And I didn't have any issue. I had no idea what she was talking about. I just like to drink and party and have a good time with my friends. And there was no harm in that. At least I couldn't see it. And when I finally did get let go from school, or they asked me to take a hiatus once again, it was the early 2000s. And I came home to a town that had been absolutely rocked and devastated by the Oxycontin epidemic. And like I had come home on breaks and like obviously I had noticed some of my friends using, and I had also tried them like intermittently, but my love at the time was alcohol. And my baby sister now has a needle in her arm. And like it just happened so quick. And it was just like I hated her. And it was like all fear-based, but it was like, how could you do this to yourself? How could you do this to a family? Like she was overdosing in the street. She was running around the projects. She was not the same person that I remembered. Like she worked up the State House. She was going to college. She was like this beautiful, fun, loving, kind. She had so many friends, and like, she was soulless when I came home. And I remember when she was like, I was probably 19, 20 years old, taking her to Spectrum. It was her first detox. And like, I remember her coming home and my mother saying like, oh, let's go on vacation. You're done. You completed. And it just shows like the complete lack of education. Like my parents had no idea what they were dealing with. And it went on like that. I remember my first AA meeting was with her. I had 5 OC80s in my bra. I had been up the entire night before. She had just come home from Spectrum. It was in like a dirty dungeon basement at St. Catherine's Church. It was a bunch of old people. And people had dropped me off in the hallway of my parents' house at 4 o'clock in the morning. I was partially closed. My heroin addict sister dragged me up 3 flights of stairs, put me to bed, put pillows behind me so I didn't choke on my own vomit. And here I am judging her. And like, she was a heroin addict and I was not. And alcohol was legal and it was socially acceptable. And like, that was just that. And I was so misinformed. And like, so I will fast forward. Everything that happened was supposed to happen. Jails, institutions, people dying, detox after detox after detox. I feel like I lived at Spectrum for a very long time. And I remember my first long time stay there. Michael Stewart was a dear friend of the family. My attorney, who has their own personal attorney, but Richie Clayman was on the board. And I would call him incessantly because I had burnt every bridge and my parents were like not having it anymore. So I would call him crying and he would get me a bed and I would go and I would stay and I would leave. And this time, Mike Stewart was like, you have nowhere to go. Like, I talked to your dad, you have nowhere to go. So it's TSS or bust. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll go over. And I met somebody in the Blue Room and I was there for, I believe, 3 months. And I got a very, I was waiting to get into the Emerson house because it was during the summer. And I was like, oh, who wouldn't want to go to the Cape for the summer? And then August came and I was like, I don't want to go to the Cape anymore. I just want to go home. And my parents like, you don't have a home. You can't come back here. And I just remember the staff being so supportive and so loving and so kind. And the kid I met was going to the Gavin house. So I talked to my parents into letting me come home and do outpatient. And then I get this phone call one day and they're like, there's a state rep on the phone for you. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And they're like, no, really? You need to come into the office. There's someone here that wants to talk to you. And I went in and it was Marty Walsh. And he started screaming at me. Like, he absolutely berated me and like told me everything that I really needed to hear. And he was like, yeah, you're not going home tomorrow. You're going to Edwina Martin house. And I was like, yeah, I beg to differ. And I ended up going home and going to IOP. And I still see him pretty frequently at meetings. And like, he still says like, because he couldn't figure out what happened to me after that. And we obviously had met multiple times along the path of my recovery, but like that meeting was a seed. It didn't do anything for me, but he planted a seed. So this kid that I met in the Blue Room, I ended up getting pregnant, married, because I'm a good Catholic girl. And, you know, my grandmother would never, she would have never had that. And things were good for about, I don't know, a year, almost a year. And I was right at the end of my pregnancy and I found him blue on the floor and I didn't know what to do. And if you can't beat him, join him. And like, it was like, I'm just going to use just once. And like every ounce of my being told me that I shouldn't, but I really truly believed that I could just use once. And I didn't care about that baby in my stomach anymore. Like, and regretfully, like, I hate saying that, but it's the truth. And like a month later, like I gave birth to a son that was addicted to heroin. And it was awful to watch. And by the grace of God, he wasn't like addicted. He didn't have to be put on medication, but DCF so kindly entered my life and my parents had to take custody and they already had, my sister had a 3-year-old at the time. And then she had another little baby that was born 3 months prior to mine at Women and Children's at Spectrum. And my parents had her too. So it was like, now they have 2 infants and a 3-year-old. And it's like, they're older. Like my father's almost 80 right now. So it's, it was really challenging. So I let my in-laws take him and I just went on a run. Like, I was like, you take him. I can't do this. I thought I was a terrible mom. The guilt and shame was overwhelming. And I just left. And, I picked up a bunch of cases. I checked into treatment. I ended up at Meridian House, which is now where I work, well, part of where I work. And, they really helped me build the infrastructure and support. And like laid the groundwork for my recovery now. And unfortunately, I didn't stay clean there either, but I learned a lot. And so fast forward to the end of my youth, I had a baby after I left Meridian House, a beautiful little girl. I stayed sober for about 2 years, I want to say. So combined, she was about 8 months when I relapsed, and I took her with me. I had no one to give her to. And like my son just went back with my in-laws, and, I never looked back, and I took this little girl on a run with me for like 8 months into crack houses. And, I don't know, just like the worst of the worst. I didn't have anywhere to go. I was living in a stolen rent-a-car. I was staying in hotels if I made enough money to put a roof over her head. And I really, in my effed up mind, thought I was a good mom. I was like feeding her cheeseburgers from McDonald's and Snickers bars. And like I changed her occasionally. And I remember one morning I woke up, we were trying to get the car jumped. We were in Danvers, and it was an undercover cop. And the next thing I knew, there were cops everywhere. So I took this little girl outside in the freezing cold, in like 18 inches of snow with no jacket on. And we hid behind a bush while they arrested my husband at the time. And I prayed to God. And after like a half an hour, she looked at me and she said, "Mommy, I'm cold." And my heart broke. And then like my second thought was, this little bitch just ruined my sneakers. And it was like, how selfish had I become? And I called my dad, who had been looking for me for months. All as they wanted was my child to be safe. And he came and got me immediately. I went to Danvers. I stayed there. I ended up leaving with some girl. And then 2 days later, I checked into Spectrum, and I have never looked back. And like,
Thank God.
yeah. Richie Clayman, I mean, thank God for that man. He saved my life time and time again. And Chuck Ferris, who I've never met, but has also indirectly saved my life, because that's who Richie called. And every single time he stepped up, and like, there were a lot of times, and they never gave up on me. And from there, I went to long-term treatment at Heart House. I went to CSS for about 10 hours. And then I went to Heart House in Tewksbury, and then the Dennis McLaughlin House in Charlestown. And then I went to my own home. And it was, I got my son back. I had my daughter, and then my husband started using again. And I took those two little kids at 2.5 years clean and went homeless, and like slept on people's couches, and like begged, borrowed, and stole. And like, that was when I found my soul and my grace and my dignity. And I went to meetings, and I raised my hands, and I cried, and I asked for help, and people helped me. And like, that's where I started my journey at North Suffolk, was like right at that point. And I just never looked back. And I mean, now my oldest is 14, my daughter's 12. I have a healthy 5-year-old. I have this amazing, amazing job that was built and created for me. I have all of these wonderful mentors and people in my life that I can turn to when I need support. My parents have gone above and beyond. It's just like, this is beyond my wildest dreams. Like, if you asked me to where I would be in 10 years, I would never, ever, ever in a million years, I would have put myself in like a 1-bedroom apartment in the middle of, God knows, probably some housing project somewhere. I wouldn't have given myself enough credit. Never. So
Literally, I could burst into tears. Your story is so amazing. As a person in recovery, I look at you and I say, you are the most inspirational. I mean, that story that your whole story. I had a couple of questions initially, and then I'm thinking, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And your story is absolutely amazing. And the fact that you're here to tell it is even more amazing. You covered so much. And I also feel like every little piece of it is the patient that comes to Spectrum and New England Recovery Center. Like you are that person.
I am that person.
You are that person.
I am.
Katie, I have so many things that I like jotted down as I heard your story that I'd love to touch on as we talk today. But to build off what Cathy just said, the thing that strikes me almost the most is how many steps were in that story, right? Like how many treatment attempts, how many, treatment episodes, how many just, tries at recovery, whether you were ready for it at the time or not, and how many chances you were given. And so, what you said about kind of you entered Spectrum and never looked back, and that was your entry into long-term recovery, I really want to encourage. And so Jesse works at our inpatient programs, right? But that's a tough spot to be sometimes working in an inpatient setting, especially a detox setting, because you only see people when they come back, right? When there has been a return to use. And so you really only get to see the side of the story of, those multiple treatment episodes, and you don't ever get to see when you were part of somebody's entry into long-term recovery, right? Like we often don't get to see that, right? And no, because those folks don't come back, right? Which is awesome. And so I really want to encourage all of our inpatient staff to listen to your story and just, kind of regain some hope too, that it doesn't matter how many times, how many chances we are given. I'm really grateful that we, as an organization, have been there for you through all of those. I've been at Spectrum for 22 years, and it really, tears in my eyes for you and your recovery story. But just, I'm just really happy to listen to you.
It made me think of Jesse is also family engagement. As you were talking about your parents, my heart, Jesse, I'm sure you're thinking of the family take on it as well, hearing her talk about.
I was thinking a lot. And thank you so much, Katie, for sharing your story. I mean, I feel like you just took us all on this journey for the last however long you were talking that I got lost in, and some themes that I pulled out of it were, perseverance. And, you never know when a seed that's planted is going to grow into some beautiful fruit. Right. And, like I said before we started this podcast, that we have a lot in common. And I, too, can identify that Spectrum was, the beginning of my long-term treatment, too. And to Cathy's point about, or Lisa's point, rather, about, oftentimes we see people at their worst. And I know when I was here, I was at my worst. And, from your story, Katie, coming in here and, I had a laugh that the blue room, we all know what the blue room is, right? It's not even blue anymore.
No.
But we still call it the blue room because that's what it is. And for those that are listening, that's where a lot of our treatment takes place here. And, it's just affectionately nicknamed that because it was at one point blue.
Yep.
But, that we oftentimes here are at our worst, and the staff here, see us at our worst and see us come back. And something I just think, and Katie, thank you for being a shining example of this, is if I don't see someone here for a while, to me, I take that as good news. No news is good news. I imagine that someone's out rocking their recovery like Katie O'Leary is, and just doing big things with, what their journey has brought them. So thank you so much, not only for giving our listeners hope, but also me some hope here.
Yeah. And at what point then, I mean, I know it was sort of a position built just for you, what you do now. And at what point did you say, I am strong enough now, I can give back. I can give back this whole, like what you're doing today is amazing, but I can only imagine as a person walking in for the first time, hearing you and meeting you, like there's no challenge that can't be overcome. You just told us every single one, and look at you sitting in a beautiful home, not in the projects.
And I mean, not that there's anything wrong with the projects. It's just, I didn't give myself enough credit. You know, I don't know. I don't know where the turning point was for that. Shannon Lundeen, who works for the Charlestown Coalition, is a dear friend of mine. In 2012, one of my other friends was taking the Recovery Coach Academy. He has a really difficult time reading and writing. So Shannon was like, why don't you bring Katie with you and she'll help you? And that's pretty much what it was. And then a few months later, North Suffolk was looking for a male and a female coach. Kim Hanton, who was my former boss, has been like a mentor to me. She's like my second mom, but she had watched my story, my sister's story. I had gone to North Suffolk for services. I don't even know how many times. I think I've been in there outpatient probably 5 times. I had 3 different clinicians there. I went to Meridian House. My sister went to Meridian House a couple of times. She was like, why don't you come over and try it? It's just part-time. And
now you manage a team of recovery coaches.
yeah, they just actually offered me a senior manager's position.
That's I mean, that is inspiration. Congrats.
Yeah.
And Lisa, I don't know if you thought this, but from the very first beginning, and we don't hear a lot about people stealing, but I hear a lot about it in the halls, that same thrill, or I don't know, Lisa could probably define it better, but it started in trauma. I heard trauma right from a very young age, that you had a brother who died. And then again, think back to some of our other episodes with trauma experts, and I think trauma is just completely interwoven into the story.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I explained that correctly. So my brother was 10 years older than me. So it was more my family's trauma than my personal trauma. So I didn't see it, but it was like something that was hidden, not taught. My parents still don't talk about it. And it's just like, yes, I see pictures. I have pictures in my house of him. And it was always like, what if he was around, this wouldn't have happened to me, because I would have had somebody there to protect me. So I was obviously affected by that, but not firsthand.
Right.
And just to give some feedback on what you just said, Cathy, about stealing, right? It's all the same, similar kind of reward pathways in your brain, right? And just that recognition that, addiction is a chronic brain disease. And so it makes sense, right? That you hear a lot about kind of, stealing, whether it predates the addiction or it kind of comes after, because it's very tied to that. You'd get that, you loved that feeling, right? You'd get that rush. And so then you want to repeat that, right? And it really is tied to kind of that reward pathway in your brain, and kind of probably teed you up in some ways, right? For that, kind of trying to get that kind of feeling back, but just using alcohol and then substances.
And I stole the first 4 months of my recovery. And like, I remember going into Ann Taylor on Newberry Street. I had my child with me. I stole a green army coat. And I was like, what the hell am I doing? Like, I'm clean. I have 2.5 years hanging over my head in 3 different courts. I have my child with me. Like, if I get caught, what happens? And like, it was the first time I played the tape all the way through. And it was like, I don't want to pay these consequences anymore. And like, then there were like various other steps after that. Like, I used to buy hot stuff. I don't do that anymore. But like, those things didn't change overnight. And I literally had to take baby steps. Like, I remember the statute of limitations is up on this, so I can talk about it. But my ex-husband was, he used to utter false scripts, and he used to utter false scripts for Perk 30s, and he used to sell them. And granted, I didn't agree with him, but I reaped all of the benefits from it. So I'm not going to lie. So like, I got to take my kids to Disney World, and I got to do things that I wouldn't normally be able to do because of all of this excess money coming in. And I remember sitting on the porch at like 18 months clean, and I was like, somebody's mom's not going to be able to sleep tonight. because these perk 30s are starting a vicious cycle of addiction for their child. And I looked at him and I was just like, if you can't stop, then I need to leave. And he continued, but then he ended up picking up. So I left anyways.
Yeah. Your morals started coming back, your conscience.
And
Sort of thing.
sometimes I think, like, working in treatment, some of the clinicians don't necessarily understand that, and they want all of these behaviors to stop immediately. And it's like, that's not going to happen. This person lived a certain way. Those are his survival skills. Like, that's his blankie from when he was a child. You can't just rip that from him. It has to be gradually weaned off and taken away. It's education, education, education. How is this going to affect your life moving forward and help them see the consequences?
Katie, that's such a good point. It's almost like, a lot of people think of it as a drug and alcohol problem, but you could look at it as a drug and alcohol solution, and life is the problem. So you take away drugs and alcohol, and then, perfect clear cut example, your stealing predates use, and you go right back to that. That may not make perfect sense to some, but it makes perfect sense to me, because that was what you were doing as a solution. I heard you early on, you said something about, you didn't want for anything as a kid, but you always wanted that one thing that you didn't get. Right. And it's feeling, I've heard in recovery, filling that God-sized hole in our heart, right? With whatever stuff or, trips or things, but it's never enough. Right. So it's not until you find a solution like you have, where you finally, learn, put that in your way. I think it was just such a great way of saying it. Your binky down or your blankie down and say, all right, I don't have to do these things anymore, because I have a better solution.
And even that chronic brain disease model, like it takes a while for your brain to change those pathways, right? Just because you stop the substances, right, that doesn't mean that you've just developed all the new pathways about doing things a different way, right? Like, it takes a while to learn that, right? It takes that through, like you said, Katie, through education, through kind of just, healing, right? All of that. It takes a while for those things to happen. And it can be frustrating. It can be frustrating for clinical staff. It can be frustrating for family, that they want to see, that chapter close, right? And then everything be different. And that's just not how, addiction works. That's not how, our brains work. That's just not how it goes.
I had that exact conversation with a family member this week. A clinician here actually used that term of, you want to see the chapter closed, but it's not. It gets messy. She used the word messy, because we're dealing with people, and we're not. Katie, I think you said something about, all these behaviors. They don't change overnight, right? They are survival skills. They are, embedded in the pathways in our brain, and that takes time. Right? Post-acute withdrawal symptoms take time. It's not this instant fix. It's so often, without the education, which I think is so important and part of what I do as well. People think we just kind of snap out of it, and we don't. Right?
If only.
If only. Right?
Katie,
and it reminds me,
coaching, and what that system is looking like how it's evolved since you've been involved in it, because it's changed a lot, since you went to Recovery Coach Academy, right, to help somebody else out. And I firmly believe that there are no coincidences, right? So that was supposed to happen. But can you just talk a little bit about that evolution of recovery coaching?
So it has definitely changed. I still think that it's a very new, and we're more in like a pilot phase. Let's see how this goes. And it's definitely evolved a lot in terms of, now we have a certification. I mean, the certification doesn't do much in terms of if somebody acts unethically or immorally. It's not like you can remove their certification, but now we're moving forward, hopefully, with licensure. And there's been lots of talks with the legislature about that. I think it's House Bill 1452 or something right now. So they just had a committee meeting regarding licensure last week. And I think that's going to move forward. I mean, obviously for reimbursement purposes, it has to, but I think that offers a lot of protection, not only to coaches, but also to agencies that employ coaches and consumers of recovery coaching. So there now seems to be some protections in place, at least with the certification piece, the supervision is included. So I think that is the most important piece to coaches, because we are so vulnerable and we're helping vulnerable populations. And I think we do it a little bit different at North Suffolk in terms of we don't stick people in one set environment. Everybody is cross-trained. So I have coaches that do outreach on the front lines, working directly with people that are actively using in Chelsea. I have recovery coaches in 6 different drug courts. I have recovery coaches in the emergency departments at Cambridge Health Alliance in Everett and Cambridge, which is where I met Cathy. And I also have coaches throughout our continuum of care at North Suffolk, whether it be intensive outpatient, our rapid access teams, our CCBHC grants, drug diversion grant. I mean, we have a bunch of different services, our residentials, but everybody's cross-trained, because if you are in the trenches and you are working with sick, unhealthy people for a long time, that sickness is going to rub off on you as well. So making sure that supervisors are trained at being observant and pulling people in when they're off, because by nature, I'll just speak for me. I'm going to tell you I'm fine. I'm a team player. I'm fine. I'm a people pleaser, and I'm going to do what it takes to get the job done in spite of myself. So we've really learned and evolved. Well, Kim Hansen taught me as a mentor that these are the things that I need to be looking for, because this is so new. There's no guidelines. There's no policies. There's no parameters in place. It's the Wild West right now. And if you want it to move forward, you have to make sure that you have the infrastructure set up so it's done ethically. Yeah. So people are going to get sick. They're going to slip. People may relapse. So like, how do you wrap around and support them? Like I was talking to one of the coaches yesterday, and she was just saying, like, I've never felt so supportive. She's a grandmother. She's raising her grandchild. Her grandchild gets sick sometimes, and she'll call me and she'll be like, I'm so sorry, I can't come in today. My response is, how do I better support you?
Yeah, I love that, Katie. I all over that, like self-care. Right?
Yeah, but it's not going to change. Her granddaughter's still going to get sick. So how do I support you so that, I don't know, maybe you can work from home today? What do you need from me so that you can still do your job?
Right. Just recognizing that we're all human, regardless of, different points in recovery, and that, whether it's accommodations, or I think the supervision is going to be huge as well.
Well, I agree. And then I also think, Katie, and it makes me, people in recovery who work in the recovery field, our jobs can't be our recovery. Like, if only it was that simple that, oh, I do this job, so now I don't ever have to manage my disease. It's not that simple. And I feel like you're giving a gift to that woman and probably everyone else on your team. They're like, okay, I'm here to support you, because you still have to be healthy or you can't do any of this. And it brings me back to many guests that Lisa and I talk about this. And I think it's triggering me to think of a future guest. Self-care, self-care, self-care. We always get back to, because as people in the field and people in recovery, if we don't take care of ourselves, it's like the oxygen mask story. If you don't put your own on, you have nothing to give to anybody else. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a classic example you just described there. And I think you sound like an amazing person to work for.
Well, it's come from the top down. So that is like the most wonderful thing about North Suffolk, is like, it is embedded in their culture. And like, that's the way I was shown. So that's the way I teach.
Beautiful.
And so, Katie, we talked a little bit before the start of the podcast. I'd love to talk to you more about that scale up of recovery coaching, as we go through this Wild West that you talk about, and really embed that more, because I just firmly believe that it's such an important role. And, I'm a clinician, but there's so many things that I can't give someone, right? That someone with lived experience can. And we need to kind of support that role, support the legislation that supports that, licensure, so that it's kind of, moved into the professional arena, right? So that it's reimbursed equitably, and so that, it's supported and it has the structure around it that protects, exactly like you said, it protects, the recovery coaches, the organizations to feel more comfortable, employing recovery coaches, and the individuals that we serve, right? Like that, it really creates that safe space. So I'd love to talk with you more about that kind of, at another time, and learn from your experience. And I just think how cool that is, of going kind of full circle, right? That I'd love to ask for your help, right, at Spectrum, right? And how cool that is, and all the points at which you interfaced with so many treatment providers, but of course, with Spectrum. So I'm really just happy to hear that. And I think that ties into a couple of things I wanted to say, kind of at the end of this podcast with Cathy. Is that one of my, there's so many things I've enjoyed about doing this, and I'm really looking forward to continuing that with you, Jesse. I think we've got a really great, kind of format going, right, of that balance of clinical and lived experience, and speaks directly to the topic we were just talking about, right, that you really do need both. But I'm just really grateful, Cathy, to you for doing this, alongside me. And I know you'll continue to support our podcast and connect us to the recovery community like you have been. And I also just, examples like talking to Katie today, and I'd love to have that follow-up conversation with Katie, right? The relationships, it's not just airing a podcast talking about things, right? It's really built connections. And so, having that connection with Katie to talk about recovery coaching, we had the podcast with Maureen Kavanaugh, and now Spectrum's running the Magnolia Fast Family Support meetings, right?
We are them too.
Yes.
Awesome.
About those connections, we run it Wednesday nights. Just gonna put that out there. If anybody wants to do it, email magnolia@spectrumhealthsystems.org, and you'll get the Zoom link. Open to all, 6 p.m. Wednesdays. I ran it this past Wednesday. It was a great group. But we've had so many opportunities for those connections. We've got a training at Spectrum, next month with our very first podcast, mine and Cathy's first podcast guest, Beck G. Cohen, who's at Transman and Recovery, and he's running, virtual trainings for the entire Spectrum organization, every single staff at every level, on the LGBTQ plus population. So, I look forward to keeping this going, for the great conversation, for the recovery stories that give us all hope, and for those connections, especially. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, what I was thinking, and hopefully Jesse will take on the role of this as well, but my goal I think you noticed maybe a pattern, that I always want to offer people hope. And, hope is sort of the shining light of this horrible, problem, or, substance use and alcohol use disorder, that there is hope. Jesse has a beautiful story. Katie's story is leaving me, it could not have been a more perfect guest to offer hope, as far as I'm concerned. So I hope over the course of, this is actually episode 16, I believe. And I hope over the course of that, we've offered hope to people who listen, because to me, I know a couple of people that I work with in the program, and I'm going to suggest they listen to this, because your story is so powerful. And I feel like hope, that is the message. And hearing people in recovery, never, ever, ever, ever give up. As long as you're breathing, there's hope, is what I say. And you are a living example of it. And you have children, and you have, dreams have come true for you. I feel like if you had picked dreams 10 years ago, you would have sold yourself wicked short.
Way short.
And Cathy, you're exactly right with the hope, right? There's nothing that we can't get through in recovery. There's no, it may seem bleak, or it may seem like, like Katie, you told many times in your story, I thought okay, here's where she gets sober, right? And then no, and then X, Y, and Z happens, right? But that could have gone on again and again and again. And then, there's this seed that's planted, it grows into this beautiful fruit. And then, here you are. So it doesn't, no matter what we go through when we're in active addiction, that doesn't disqualify us from a life of dignity and respect and recovery. And I thank you for sharing your story. And I think that you're a shining example of just that, of dignity and respect in recovery.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. When the pain gets great enough, we change. Or when the pain gets great enough, I change. Only speak for me. So, but I really appreciate you all having me. I'm going to miss you.
I'll still be around, not to worry. And I'm sure they're going to tap into you for additional information and possibly another chance on the show here. And
anything you need.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. It's been a joy and a pleasure. And Lisa, you're in good hands with Jesse. It's been fun. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.